Hey, how's it going today, everybody? My name is Will Tran with the Filmmaker's Code, and today we are talking about what makes a good camera. There are obviously a lot of different factors that you're going to have to look into whenever you're buying and or renting a camera for your next project. We're going to go through a list of factors that you need to pay attention to whenever you're looking at these cameras, but of course you need to choose for yourself which factors are the most important to you. But to give you guys our guidelines for whenever we're looking into cameras, we're going to start with the most obvious things that you should be paying attention to in a camera first, and then we're going to work our way down to the factors that aren't as important but are still great to pay attention to. Starting with number one, resolution. Obviously, a resolution is the measurement of pixels from left to right, top to bottom. At this point in time for any cinematic video, 4K is the standard. 5 years ago, 1080p was the standard, but we have moved on since, hence most displays are in 4K. So when we're shooting projects, we absolutely say that we should at minimum be shooting 4K, nothing lower than that. 3840 by 2160 or 4096 by 2160 are our minimum standard, and we do not go anywhere below this. Now, obviously there are cameras that shoot 8K at this point, but in our opinion, they're absolutely overkill unless you have very specific reasons to use it. Several areas that 8K absolutely shines in is reframing. You're able to scale the image up, reframe the shot with a very minimal loss in quality. That way you can get two camera angles with just one camera. You can scale in by 150%, 175, maybe even sometimes 200%, and not notice a loss in quality up until a certain point, of course. This is very prominent in the Netflix show House of Cards. They only shot with one camera, but they're able to reframe the image just by scaling it in, giving them the ability to have a different camera angle. Also with 8K, this does help with post-production camera stabilization, even if you push the warp stabilizer just a little bit. Also, I don't know how many of us are into VFX work, but I've worked in VFX a little bit, and 8K does help with motion tracking, which results in a better camera solve and is overall a much better experience than working in 4K. Overall, with the higher resolution, this results with more flexibility in post-production. But of course, this is not an excuse to shoot anything incorrectly. A higher resolution is just a fail-safe should you mess up a shot and you missed it whenever you were on set. Now, even though we do say that 4K is our minimum standard, 1080p is still acceptable at this day and age. However, do not go below 1080p. Every single display at this point in time is at minimum 1080p, and the days of 720p are long gone. So if at this point you don't have the funds to rent or buy a camera that shoots in 4K, you at minimum should be sticking to 1080p. Moving on from resolution, let's talk about the second thing on this list, and that is sensor size. So the sensor on your camera is the piece of hardware that collects light information and processes it into an image. And different cameras will have different sensor sizes. In the indie filmmaking space, the most common sensor sizes that you're gonna run into are micro four thirds, APS-C, Super 35, and full frame. All these different sensor sizes are going to affect your image in different ways. The most prominent thing that sensor size affects is crop factor. Here are all the crop factors for different sensor sizes on screen, and these crop factors affect your focal length equivalence. For example, a 20mm lens on an APS-C sensor is not truly 20mm due to the crop factor of 1.6 times. You must multiply your focal length by the camera's crop factor. So as you can see in this example, 50mm times 1.6 is equivalent to 80mm on a full frame sensor. But you just need to understand that the full frame sensor is the only sensor with no crop factor. So 50mm is truly 50mm on a full frame sensor. At the same time, sensor size will affect your depth of field, as the amount of blur that you have on the background will be different across different sensor sizes. And moreover, sensor size will affect your camera's low light capability. A larger sensor has more space on it to collect light information, and that's why larger sensors tend to perform better in low light. I know there's a lot of things that sensor size affects, but sensor size also affects pixel quality. 4K on a camera will look different from 4K on your phone camera, due to the fact a designated camera sensor is much bigger than an iPhone's camera sensor. Yes, an iPhone can shoot in 4K, but the sensor is so much smaller, therefore the pixel size is smaller, resulting in lower pixel quality. So even though the R5 that I'm shooting on right now and the iPhone have both the same pixel quantities, the pixel quality is different because the pixels are bigger on the camera I'm using than that of the iPhone. However, the most common sensor size that you're going to be working with in the filmmaking world is Super 35. These sensors are the most common sensors that you're going to find in most cinema cameras. The reason being is because this replicates the original 35mm film format that we shot in the old days. Moving on to number 4, frame rate capabilities. At minimum, we say our camera should at least be able to shoot up to 60 frames a second. This gives us the ability to shoot slow motion if we want to use it. Anything higher than 60 frames a second is just a nice bonus. But understand that with most cameras, as you go up in resolution, typically that means you sacrifice on frame rate capability. The R5 can shoot in 8K, but it can only shoot at 8K at 30 frames a second. So at minimum, we always choose cameras that can shoot at minimum 4K 60 frames a second. But if you guys are just starting out, 1080p 60 frames a second is the absolute bare minimum. Moving on from frame rate capability, we're going to talk about dynamic range. Dynamic range, as you saw from the exposure video, is your camera's ability to capture details within the highlights and the shadows. More expensive and sophisticated cameras will have more dynamic range. The RED cameras that we shoot a lot of our projects on boast a whopping 16.5 stops of dynamic range. The more stops of dynamic range that you have, the more flexibility that you have in post. Even if you don't absolutely need the information in the blown out window or the darkest parts of the image, they are still there for you to use should you want to lift them up a little bit. Cheaper cameras won't have as many stops of dynamic range, and the information in the highlights and shadows are going to be lost due to the camera not being able to capture the information. 16.5 stops is fairly high, considering that's what you're paying for whenever you're using a RED camera and or cinema cameras. Moving on from dynamic range, we're going to talk about color depth. Color depth is just how many colors can your camera capture, and color depth is measured by bits, such as 8-bit, 10-bit, 12-bit, etc. Obviously, a higher bit depth, the better, because the more colors that your camera captures. R5 right here is specifically shooting in 10-bit, which gives me a lot more color range to work with in post-production. Consumer and prosumer grade cameras will shoot in either 8-bit or 10-bit, and cinema cameras that are more sophisticated would shoot in something like 12-bit. Something that bit depth will absolutely affect is color binning. If you point two different cameras with different color depths at the sky, you're going to notice that the camera with lower bit depth is going to have color binning. You're going to see stripes of different shades of blue because the camera does not collect as much information as a 10-bit camera. With 8-bit, you're going to see those stripes of colors, whereas 10-bit and higher, you're going to see either thinner lines or ideally a very nice gradient. This is because higher bit depths collect more colors, therefore they have more colors in between, so they can replicate the nice gradient. All right, at this point I've lost kind of where we're at, so just trust the text right here. Next thing on this list is highlight roll-off. Highlight roll-off is something that's very specific, and you've probably noticed this effect before, but you couldn't quite put your finger on it. Highlight roll-off is your camera's ability to transition from the highest highlights to clipped information. Prosumer cameras typically don't have as good of a highlight roll-off as a more sophisticated camera. With consumer and prosumer cameras, the highlight roll-off is very abrupt. We're snapping immediately from dark to bright. Whereas a more sophisticated cinema camera, we will always see a nice gradient from the highest highlights to the clipped information. Cameras that have better dynamic range typically do have better highlight roll-off because they're able to capture that information around the blown out highlight. Now you can actually fake highlight roll-off with a diffusion filter, but it's not going to compare with a camera with better highlight roll-off. We're heading towards the end of this list, so as you can tell, these things are getting more and more specific, but the next thing on this list is dual native ISO. All cameras have a native ISO, which is the camera's most comfortable ISO to sit at to give you the most dynamic range possible. Most cameras have one native ISO, but there are specific cameras that have dual native ISOs for both dark and bright lighting conditions, such as the Sony FX6 with one native ISO at 800 like most cameras and another at 12,800. So you can shoot at either one of these ISOs with little to no grain. Obviously the lower ISO is for normal lighting conditions, and the higher ISO is made for darker conditions. So if you shoot in a lot of low light, look for cameras with dual native ISOs. This is why Sony cameras are considered the masters of low light. Their ISO can go extremely high with little to no grain. And the last thing that we have on this list is lens mount swappability. Again, this is a very specific thing in cameras where you can actually unscrew the mount and replace it with a different lens mount so you can use whatever lens that you want on it. Yes, you can use lens adapters, say to use a Sony lens on a Canon camera. I don't know why you'd want to do that, but keep in mind that using adapters will actually create space between the back element of the lens and the sensor. The more space that you create between the back element and the sensor, the more problems you encounter, such as vignetting and focal plane complications. Because the lens is further away from the sensor, you're gonna actually start seeing the edges of the lens, and it's also gonna be harder to pull focus because of the amount of space between the lens and the sensor. Okay, so those are all the things that we believe you should be looking at whenever you're choosing your next camera. You can probably see now that with more expensive cameras that have more of these features, they give you more flexibility in post-production. There is more margin for error with more expensive cameras. However, like I said, better cameras does not mean you have an excuse to shoot incorrectly. Get your shots correct on set. But I hope you guys learned something from this video. If you have any more questions, let me know, and I'll see you in the next video.